Okay, so I think we're on the go. Let's read tonight, but we're going to read from the book of Jeremiah. And it's not directly related to the portion we'll look at in Daniel 1 tonight, but it is a little bit more background on Nebuchadnezzar's expeditions into Israel, and specifically his uh, his sacking of Jerusalem. And so we'll read in Jeremiah 39. Jeremiah 39. And in this chapter, the king that is mentioned in Judah is Zedekiah. He's the last king of Judah. And he's the one that's there when on the third expedition of Nebuchadnezzar into Israel, that he's the king that sees the temple destroyed, and the last group of people taken out of the land. And this has to do with Jeremiah. And the reason I'm mentioning Jeremiah is because, of course, later on in Daniel, we'll see that Daniel is reading Jeremiah's letter, or the book that becomes in our Bible the book of Jeremiah. So we'll read in chapter 39 and verse 1. In the 9th year of Zedekiah, king of Judah, in the 10th month came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and all his army against Jerusalem, and they besieged it. And in the 11th year of Zedekiah, in the 4th month, the 9th day of the month, the city was broken up. And all the princes of the king of Babylon came in and sat in the middle gate, even Nergal-Sharezer, Samgar-Nebo, Sarsechim, Rabsaris, Nergal-Sharezer, Rabmag, with all the residue of the princes of the king of Babylon. And it came to pass that when Zedekiah, the king of Judah, saw them, and all the men of war, then they fled and went forth out of the city by night, by the way of the king's garden, by the gate between the two walls, and he went out by the way of the plain. But the Chaldean army pursued after them and overtook Zedekiah in the plains of Jericho. And when they had taken him, they brought him to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, to Riblah in the land of Hamath, where he gave judgment upon him. And then the king of Babylon slew the sons of Zedekiah in Riblah before his eyes, and also the king of Babylon slew all the nobles of Judah. Moreover, he put out Zedekiah's eyes and bound him with chains to carry him to Babylon. And the Chaldeans burned the king's house and the houses of the people with fire, and broke down the walls of Jerusalem. And then Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried away captive into Babylon the remnant of the people that remained in the city, and those that fell away, that fell to him with the rest of the people that remained. But Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, left of the poor of the people which had nothing in the land of Judah, and gave them vineyards and fields at the same time. Now, the next few verses talk about Jeremiah. And if you notice the times, at the beginning of this chapter, it said that Nebuchadnezzar came in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign. It was in the 11th year, so there's been a siege for almost a couple of years before Jerusalem falls. And in that time, the Chaldean army would have been gathering intelligence about all that's going on inside the city. And so they knew about Jeremiah. And so in verse 11 now, it says, Now Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, gave charge concerning Jeremiah to Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, saying, Take him and look well to him, and do him no harm, but do unto him even as he shall say unto you. And so Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, sent, and Nebuchadnezzar, Rabsaris, and Nergal-Sharezer, Rabmag, and all the king of Babylon's princes, even they sent, and took Jeremiah out of the court of the prison, and committed him unto Gedaliah the son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, that he should carry him home, and so he dwelt among the people. Now, the reason for that is because Jeremiah had been speaking to the king and to the people, giving them a message from God, and God had told them, he says, give yourselves up and it will be well with you. But Zedekiah didn't take heed to God's warning, and so he held out against Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar eventually sacked the city and took Zedekiah into captivity. In fact, Zedekiah ended up, all his children were killed in front of him, as we read, but also Zedekiah had his eyes put out, and then he was carried away to Babylon to live out the remainder of his days blind, with the last thing that he saw was his children being executed. And so Nebuchadnezzar knew about Jeremiah, knew what Jeremiah had been telling the people from God, and because of that, he showed mercy to Jeremiah. And then in chapter 40 and verse 1, it says, the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord after Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, had let him go from Ramah, when he had taken him being bound in chains among all that were carried away captive of Jerusalem and Judah, which were carried away captive unto Babylon. And the captain of the guard took Jeremiah and said to him, the Lord thy God. Now you'll notice this pagan man is saying, Jehovah thy God, the Lord thy God. Jehovah thy God has pronounced evil upon this place. Now Jehovah has brought it and done according as he has said, because you have sinned against the Lord and have not obeyed his voice, and therefore this thing has come upon you. And what he's going to offer Jeremiah is, come back with me to Babylon. This is in verse 4, and you'll be looked after. But Jeremiah says, well, thank you, but no thank you. I'm going to stay right here. And so this is a little bit of background. And when in Daniel's life would this have occurred? Well, if you remember, Daniel was captured in 605 BC. And now we have the fall of Jerusalem. The final fall of Jerusalem is about 22 and a half years later. And you'll remember we were using the age of 15 for Daniel when he was taken into captivity. And so this is literally when Daniel is about 37, 38 years old. And so Daniel's very aware of all that's going on because at this time he is, as we'll see later in the book of Daniel, he is one of Nebuchadnezzar's confidants. He's an advisor to Nebuchadnezzar. And so while Nebuchadnezzar is away on this expedition into Israel, Daniel would be quite aware of everything that's going on. News of what went on would be going back to Babylon. And so Daniel would be quite aware of what was happening with the Lord's prophet Jeremiah there in the land of Israel. And so that's just a little bit more of background with regard to this book. And so let's go back to chapter 1 of Daniel, and we'll continue to think about chapter 1. Last week, we finished off thinking about verses 1 to 5, and really verses 6 and 7 go along with that little portion. We'll just mention those briefly. It says, among the young men who were given the schooling of Babylon, that is the university, if you like, the university training for 3 years. It says in verse 6, now among these were from the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And as we mentioned towards the end last week, there was a re-education program to have these young men from Israel begin to think as Babylonians and not to be thinking as Israelites, and to change their whole nature and their whole lives to make them Babylonish rather than Israelitish. And so in verse 7, part of that re-education is to rename them. And so it says the prince of the eunuchs, and we met him in verse 3. His name was Ashpenaz. And so Ashpenaz gives Daniel the name of Belteshazzar. And to Hananiah, he gives Shadrach, and to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. Now we thought briefly about the meaning of their Hebrew names, and now they are named something different as far as Babylon is concerned. And so Daniel, of course, his name Daniel means God is my judge, but he's given Belteshazzar, and that means Bel, and Bel was one of the gods that the Babylonians would have worshipped. Bel, protect his life, is what Belteshazzar means. And then for Hananiah, his Hebrew name means God is gracious, but Shadrach, the name he is given, it means the command of Aku. And Aku was again another one of the gods of Babylon. Of course, last week we talked about Marduk, who was the principal god of Babylon, but these are other gods that the Babylonians would also worship. And then Mishael, his Hebrew name meant who is as God is. And he's given Meshach, and it is almost the same except a different god, because it means who is what Aku is. And so again, trying to change the whole life and thinking of these young men by giving them the names of Babylonian gods. And the last one, Azariah, Hebrew name means God has helped. And then Abednego, which is actually a hyphenated name in the original, it's Abed-Nego. And Nego is a kind of a corruption of the god Nebo. And Nebo is also in Nebuchadnezzar's name. So that first part of Nebuchadnezzar's name also refers to Nebo, and Nebo being another Babylonian god, kind of a personal god to Nebuchadnezzar. And so Abednego is the servant of Nebo, the servant of Nebo. And so again, it is all this re-education process to make them into Babylonians rather than Hebrews. And so as we move on from that, then we move into verse 8, and we have what I'm calling the test. And what's it a test of? It's a test of faithfulness. And we see that in verses 8 through 16. Of course, we're perfectly aware of what that test is. And the test has to do with the king's food. And but I want us to notice that obviously as we read this, we see that these young men are faithful to their God, to Jehovah, but their faithfulness didn't start when they were in these circumstances in Babylon. Their faithfulness was because in Judah, when they still lived there before being captured, they were part of the faithful remnant that God always had. And you'll remember that in those last years of the kingdom of Judah, the kings were bad kings. It was a time of apostasy. And the apostasy, if you like, the cup of apostasy filled up so full that was when God then brought the judgment of discipline upon them to take them into Babylon. But these young men, it wasn't suddenly because they became captives that they were now concerned about being faithful to God. These were faithful young men who were taken into captivity. And now the test is, will they remain faithful? They have had privilege in Judah. They were part of the elite. They were part of the royal family and the nobles. And so even within that milieu, even though there was much corruption and much apostasy in those that surrounded them there, these young men were faithful. They were part of the faithful remnant that God always had. among the children of Israel. And so now that they're in Babylon, this test will be a test as to whether they will remain faithful. And of course, the principal one that we're concerned with is Daniel himself, because God is going to use him in a particular way. And so God needs to have one who is faithful to him to be able to use him in the way that he's going to show throughout the book of Daniel. Now, that's not to say that the other three gentlemen weren't faithful to God on a continuing basis at all. We don't know the rest of their lives. We see them up to the point where they are put into the fiery furnace, and they're faithful then, and they're faithful up to then, but we don't see them again in Daniel in the later part of their lives. We can assume perhaps that they remained faithful just like Daniel did, but of course later on in the book, Daniel is the focus. And so these faithful young men didn't start being faithful when they just found themselves in these circumstances. You know, in thinking about lessons that we'll see as we go through here, and I think there's quite a few lessons that we can learn from this situation that we find in chapter 1. It is always interesting to see among young people those who truly have a desire for the Lord. And it tends to be that when you see that desire for the Lord in their youthfulness, that it continues into their adulthood. Obviously, there's always the exceptions. There's always those who fall by the wayside. But in general, when you see young people who have a desire for the Word of God, who have a desire for a relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ, who are concerned about the gospel and about the local assembly, then it tends to be also that as they go on in life, they tend to be the ones who remain faithful. And in our situation, of course, we see that especially in the area of education, because often those who do not show particular devotion to the Lord in their youth, they may have that veneer of Christianity. They may have grown up in Christian homes and had the benefit and the experience of being exposed to the Word of God for a good part of their lives in their youth, and yet they have never really demonstrated seriousness about the things of God. And then when they go off either into further schooling or even into the workforce, then it tends to be that we see them as those who have fallen by the wayside. And there seems to be so many of those in our day. And so, again, the importance of recognizing those who are truly seeking to serve the Lord, those who truly seem to have a genuine, warm relationship with the Lord in their youth, and encouraging them in that and supporting them in that when they grow up into adulthood, that then they continue, like Daniel, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, and they continue to be faithful to the Lord. And so, again, there's this tendency among our youth, and when you go to various assemblies, and you say, and you go to those assemblies, and you know that of many of the families there, they had children who grew up in those assemblies, and you ask where they are, and there's a kind of a disappointed silence or a disappointed look, and people will tell you, well, they're not walking with the Lord. And so, again, the importance of identifying those who truly walk with the Lord in their youth and encourage them into adulthood. And so the question is going to be, do we compromise or not? And we'll talk about what the compromise would be, because we have this situation where the king is the king is expecting them to be fed with the same food provision that the king himself has. And this is perhaps seen as something that is a generosity of the king to these young captives that seem to have potential to serve him. Perhaps it's an indication of the king's favor to those who are being trained in this 3-year school experience to be fitted out for service in the Babylonian kingdom. But one way or another, the king expects that these young men will have the same diet that he himself has. And so in verse 8, without it going far, and I think the order is significant here, it says, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Now, if you were telling the story, you might talk about the food provision that the king was making, and that these young men come and they see what is expected of them, and then they have to make a decision about what they're going to do with this provision of food. But that's not where this starts. This starts with a decision that Daniel makes in his own heart and in his mind. And his decision is that he will not defile himself. Now, it doesn't, when it comes down to it, this is a decision that is made before the situation really develops and arrives. As Daniel's taken into Babylon, he knows that he's going into a pagan situation. He has a fair idea, being from the royal or the noble lines back in Judah. He would know what would be expected if you're part of the king's court and the king's under the king's direct influence. And he would know that similar things would happen in Babylon. And so he's anticipating that there's something that is going to crop up where he is going to have to make the decision either to compromise or to not compromise. And, you know, I find that a lot of our young people today, when they are heading off to university or into the workforce, and they're in that place where they are moving away from home, perhaps for the first time, they really haven't been dealt with to think about how they are going to handle the first time that they come up against something that so obviously clashes with their supposed Christian beliefs and with the Word of God. And so they go unprepared. I mean, in the back of their minds, I believe that they have a general idea that they're moving into a situation where it's not all like they've been brought up in, and it's not all going to be a bed of roses for them, and that perhaps along the way they're going to have to deal with a few things. But I find that many of them are totally unprepared. There were young believers that I came across when I was in the RCMP, and they were thinking of joining the RCMP. And my advice to them always was, as soon as you get to depot, and when they get to depot, they're all going to be in a 32-person dorm. A little later on, some of them were fortunate, they got individual rooms, but generally you were in a 32-person dorm where everybody was in the same room. And so my advice to them always was, as soon as you get there and you start to unpack, make sure that the first thing out of your belongings that you unpack is your Bible, and you put it in a prominent place so that those around you will see that. It communicates a message right away. And it means that when they challenge you, which somebody likely will, that then you are going to stand. You're going to have to witness for the Lord. It may be a very simple witness. Obviously, their lives are going to have to continue to be a witness as they're with those 32 people for 6 months. But don't be behind the door and make it obvious, because the more you hide it and the more you hide what you are, the tougher it is going to be when it comes down to the crunch, and then you really have to stand for the Lord. And so this is Daniel, and Daniel is preparing himself in his heart and his mind to deal with what he knows is coming. And so his decision is that he would not defile himself. Now, I think that is not simply in the matter of the king's food, but that's the specific test. Daniel came as a believer in Jehovah, and I think there was that general understanding that he had of himself, that he had made up his mind that no matter what came, he wouldn't defile himself with all that Babylon had to offer. But in this specific case, it comes down to a specific test. Now, why is this a test? Well, first of all, we understand, not specifically from the book of Daniel here, but we also understand even from secular history that much of the food that the king would have eaten would have been sacrificed first to the gods of Babylon. Or at least not so much sacrificed, but presented to the gods of Babylon in thankfulness for their bounty. And not only that, but even what they drank. Of course, in the law, there was no specific part of the law that said they shouldn't drink alcohol. But in this particular case, the alcohol that is given to them and provided to them, again, as part of this libation or this offering to the gods of Babylon. And therefore, to take it would be to be part of the submission to the gods of Babylon. It would be a symbolic giving credit to the gods of Babylon. It would be acknowledging the gods of Babylon as actual gods with a large G and not just a small g, as something that was real. And so Daniel, he decided, well, that's not going to happen. I'm not going to give in to that because I worship Jehovah, and therefore to acknowledge any other god is to go against the law that's where God says you'll not have any other gods before me. And so that's one part of this whole situation, I would suggest. And not only that, but it would also contain foods that were regarded as unclean by the law. For instance, pork. The Babylonians would have no difficulty eating pork. That could likely be some of the meat, for instance, along with other things that the law regarded as unclean, and that would have been put before these young men. And so once again, Daniel has thought ahead, and he's realized what could come in an apparently innocuous thing, diet. And in this diet, he realized there were so many booby traps, if you like, in which he could fall into the trap that would bring disrespect to his God, and that because he would be going against his God, may bring the wrath of God in the form of discipline in his life. And so he wasn't prepared to allow that to happen. And then, as well as that, the food that would have been presented may not have been drained of blood. You'll remember that in the law, and not only in the law, but outside of the law, God prohibited the eating of meat that still had blood in it. And he gave the reason because the blood is the life. And so it had a particular meaning to the Jews. And so again, if food was presented that still had blood in it, again, it would have brought defilement to Daniel and to his friends. We see those laws set out in Leviticus. And in Leviticus 11, it talks about the forbidden foods that God forbade them to eat. In Leviticus 17, it talks about the blood and not eating food that still had blood in it. And then, as well as that, the whole idea of being associated with the idols of Babylon. The Apostle Paul addresses this idea as well in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. If we go there for just a moment or two, I don't want to spend a lot of time there, but we will go there for a moment or two in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. And you may remember that in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and I see we're going to deal with both those chapters. Chapter 8. In chapter 8, in verse 1, it says, "Now as touching things offered to idols, you know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but charity edifies. And if any man thinks that he knows anything, he knows nothing yet as he ought to know. But if any man love God, the same is known of him. As concerning, therefore, the eating of those things that are offered in sacrifice to idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is none other God but one." And so Paul goes through a teaching series, if you like, here in this chapter. And the idea is that if you are aware that the food has been offered to idols, then it can become sin if you partake of that food. Don't want to spend a lot of time there, but I also want to go over to chapter 10. And in chapter 10, we often think, or some people think of chapter 10 as referring to the Lord's Supper, just like it does in 1 Corinthians 11. But I would suggest to you that the Lord's Supper is not in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And of course, people will refer to the Lord's Supper as communion, and they get that term from chapter 10. But it's not talking about the Lord's Supper particularly here. What it's talking about is the provision of the Lord. And we find the same idea in Old Testament passages. It talks about the table of the Lord. And so in verse 14 in 1 Corinthians 10, it says, "Wherefore, my dearly beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to wise men, judge what I say. The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ?" If you go through this and compare it to chapter 11, you'll come out with about 10 to 12 differences between the two chapters. And one of the differences here is the idea of the blood first. In 1 Corinthians 11, in the breaking of bread, the cup is second and the bread is first. And it's because in 1 Corinthians 10, it's talking about something completely different. It is not talking about the breaking of bread. And then in verse 16, also in chapter 10, it says, "The bread that we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? For we being many are one bread and one body, for we are all partakers of that one bread." And so what it's actually talking about here is the provision of God for his people. And we can see the same sort of idea. We could see it in Malachi, we can see it in Ezekiel, we can see it in the Psalms, but we'll just take Malachi as an example. And in Malachi chapter 1 and verse 7, It says, you offer polluted bread upon mine altar, and you say, wherein have we polluted thee? In that you say, the table of the Lord is contemptible. The table of the Lord. Now, when we think of the table of the Lord, people will use that phrase in relation to the breaking of bread. But that's not what's been talked about. Also in verse 12 in Malachi chapter 1, it says, you say, but you have profaned it in that you say, the table of the Lord is polluted, and the fruit thereof, even his meat, is contemptible. And so if we went to Ezekiel, we'd see this phrase again, the table of the Lord. If we went to Psalm 23, we see the idea of the table of the Lord. And also in a number of other occasions in the scriptures. And the idea of the table of the Lord is that which the Lord has provided to us for living and for service to him. And so in chapter 10 in 1 Corinthians, it is the idea that we don't take off the table of Satan. We don't take his provision. And that's why it goes on and it says in verse 18, behold Israel after the flesh, are not they which eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? What say I then, that the idol is anything, or that which is offered in sacrifice to idols is anything? But I say that the things that the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I would not that you should have fellowship with devils or demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot be partakers of the Lord's table and the table of demons. And so the idea is, as Paul wrote to the Corinthians, and on one occasion they're meeting with the Lord's people, and on the next occasion they're going to the pagan temples. And Paul is simply saying, hey, you got to make up your mind. What are you? Do you follow the Lord or not? Are you looking to the Lord for provision, or are you kind of trying to mix everything up and hang on to the old life with the table of demons, that is, that which has been offered to idols, and you're trying to have the best of both worlds? And he's basically saying it doesn't work like that. You either go with the Lord's provision, or you go with the provision that the demons make through the sacrifices to idols. And so in verse 22, he then asks the question, do you provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than him? In other words, here you are, you're trying to ride this line. You're trying to be all things to all people. You're trying to go with the unbelievers and sort of be part of them, but you're also trying to go with the believers and be part of them. And Paul's saying that's not how it works. You have to go one way or the other. And so in verse 23, he says, all things are lawful for me, but all things are not expedient, and all things are lawful for me, but all things edify not. And as he goes on, we'll not spend more time in this chapter, but it's this idea of the conscience, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, because this is part of the test that Daniel faced, Daniel and his friends faced. And so it was this, the temptation to ride the line. Yes, we're Israelites. Yes, we're Jews. Yes, our God is Jehovah. But we're in a unique situation here where we are prisoners. What harm would it be to eat the king's food and not rock the boat? I mean, we can hang on to our beliefs, but surely we could be forgiven for not causing trouble here simply by taking the king's food. And it's this idea, again, where Daniel had sorted out in his own mind what Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians 10 you got to be on one side of the fence or the other. You can't ride the fence and do both. And so that's why it starts off that Daniel purposed in his heart. There was no question for him. He knew which side of the fence he was on. He knew which side his bread was buttered on, if you like. He was sticking with Jehovah, even if it brought him into conflict with the situation and the circumstances that he was in, and with the people that he was now responsible to. And so this is one of those things that not only young people, but particularly young people who are growing up and moving out into the world, we got to encourage them and help them to get to that place of commitment, so much, such strong commitment to the Lord that there's no question. They have already purposed in their heart that they're going to honor the Lord regardless of what circumstances come along. And so that would guide their thinking, and it would guide their behavior as they come into different situations in life. And so we find this same thing, for instance, with Joseph way back in Genesis chapter 39. In Genesis 39 is the account of him in Potiphar's home, and Potiphar's wife is making advances towards him. And again, it's one of these times when there is a decision to be made, and you could rationalize it away. Well, nobody will know, or I don't want this, but this woman keeps pursuing me. You could make all sorts of excuses, or he could have, to do the wrong thing, and yet he didn't. And so in verse 9 of chapter 39, we see basically the same thing that we see with Daniel. And in the end of verse 9, Joseph says, "How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And so again, here's a young man in his situation who has already made up his mind. His behavior is not determined by the circumstances he's in. His behavior is determined by his commitment to his God. And obviously, it doesn't always turn out well. For Daniel, it eventually turned out well. But for Joseph, it didn't turn out all that great. He ends up in prison for several years. And so, again, there's two words that I always emphasize when it comes to these matters, and that is circumstances and consequences. Very often we can't help the circumstances. Things come along in life where they are a challenge to our faith, challenge to our fidelity to God, but we sometimes start to rationalize because we start to think about the consequences. And as we think about the consequences, we can see all the bad things that could happen if we stand for the Lord. And so in the Christian life, when it comes to this, very often we can't help the circumstances, but we can ignore the anxiety that comes from thinking about the consequences. Now, I'm not talking about being unwise, but I am talking about when it comes down to where the rubber actually meets the road, that we have determined to stand for the Lord, and we will allow the Lord to take care of the circumstances thereafter. For Joseph, it was circumstances that put him in jail. That wasn't very good. In a sort of human thinking. For Daniel, the circumstances worked out and the consequences also took care of themselves. And he did not end up in this particular case in a difficult situation. But you'll remember that later on in his life were the men around him who were jealous of him, tried to get him in trouble, and they induced the king to pass a law that said that nobody could pray to or worship anything but the king. And Daniel ignored the possible consequences and kept on doing what he always did. He went at the time of prayer and he prayed towards Jerusalem. And of course, that ended up with him ending up in the lion's den. And so, again, we got to get this concept across to believers in general, but also to young people in particular, that when we walk with the Lord, we have to have decided beforehand that no matter what comes, we'll stand for the Lord. And even if it results in consequences that are not favorable to us, we're going to leave the consequences to the Lord. And we pull together the total teaching of Scripture. And for instance, in Romans chapter 8, it tells us that all things work together for good to those who are called according to his purpose. Now, it doesn't say that all things are good. It doesn't say that every circumstance we find ourselves in is a good thing. But it does say that God takes those things and he eventually weaves them all together and weaves the consequences together so that they actually end up with a good thing. Now, God works out that which is good in the circumstances and in the consequences that we find ourselves in. And so this is a major lesson from Daniel. And that lesson is, number one, as believers, we are to be committed to the Lord and not worry about the consequences of circumstances we find ourselves in. And then as we go on, we find out what happened with this group that Daniel was in. And we find that he makes this request to Ashpenaz, the prince of the eunuchs, and he goes to Ashpenaz and he respectfully asks to not have to take the king's food and drink, and and he tells Ashpenaz that he doesn't want to defile himself. Well, I suspect he would explain what that meant, that within the laws of his religion, that to take some of what the king offered by way of food and drink that had been offered to idols would mean a complete disrespect of his own God, of Jehovah, and he couldn't agree to be part of that. And so it's interesting because in verse 9, we find that God has brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. Now, these words, favor and tender love, the word favor here in the original language means kindness or goodwill. And so God had already been at work in the heart of this man, and he responded to Daniel with goodwill. He didn't immediately just shut him down, which he could have done, because here's a man who's in power. He's empowered to be over all of these new recruits, if you like, and he could have just said, forget it. Just go away and do what you're told, sort of thing. But he didn't do that because God had already been at work in this man. And so the man responds in kindness. Now, he's not going to agree to allow Daniel and the others to forego the food, but he responds kindly to them. And the word here, tender love, it's a word that talks about deep sympathies. And perhaps even as these young men who have been wrenched away from their families, they've been wrenched away from their country, they've been wrenched away from everything that they know, and now this man's responsible for them, and perhaps even he had a sympathy for them in their circumstances. Regardless of his sympathies, he had a job to do. And so he refuses to allow Daniel and his friends to forego the food and the drink. And not only that, he realized what could happen if there wasn't compliance with Nebuchadnezzar's requirements. and he knew that he could endanger his life. So in verse 10, it says, the prince of the eunuchs, this is Ashpenaz again, said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed what you're to eat and drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children that are of your sort? In other words, if you guys don't take this food, you're going to start looking sick. You're going to start looking as though you're fading away. You're going to start looking like people who've been starved. And why would the king not compare you with the other guys who are actually taking the king's food? So you realize that even of all of these that were taken from Judah, all these ones from the royal line and from the nobility, this is a small group, a remnant, who are actually walking with their God so closely that they actually are willing to obey the Lord rather than do fall in and compromise with what's happening in the circumstances in which they're in. And you know, I've observed the same thing in a work situation. You get people who claim to be believers. They'll maybe talk to you about it, but nobody else knows that they're believers. Why? Because they're basically compromising their testimony, and they're as much like the unbelievers around as the unbelievers are themselves. And so you see it in a school situation where you have a whole bunch of people and you have young people, and some of them are very obviously believers and everybody knows it. And then there's those who are religious and maybe even go to the same churches or assemblies as the ones that are obviously believers, but they don't really want to know and let anybody know that they are also supposed to be believers. And it's the same in a large situation like the RCMP. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, and within those hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, in my experience in working in that, again, there are those who nobody really knows they have any sort of, and I'll just call it religious interest. They're certainly not going to stand out for the Lord, but because you kind of stand out, they will quietly or sort of secretly, when no one else is around, they'll talk to you about being a Christian, whatever that means to them. And but we have that same situation here in Babylon. The greater number of those that are taken are not in this small remnant group. And it tends to be the same down through history, where God's people, those who truly walk with the Lord, tend to be the remnant, tend to be the small group within the large group that supposedly follows the Lord. And this is the situation we have in Babylon now. All of these other Jews, they are taking the king's food. They are blending in. They're compromising. But Daniel and his friends are those who are going to stand for the Lord. But I want you to notice, in coming to Ashpenaz, they don't come in any sort of anger. They don't come and they say, you know, our God doesn't allow us to do this, and our God's this, and our God that, and we're going to stand for our God. No, they come respectfully to this man who has responsibility, and they respectfully ask him if they can forego taking what is required of them, and they get their answer. The answer is given gently. There was absolutely no obligation on Ashpenaz to make an explanation of why he was turning down the request. He could have just simply said no, but because God had worked in his life and in his heart, even though he didn't know that, he answers them in kindness and in gentleness, but firmly, no, you have to eat the food. And so that's the first round of what's going on here. And so we come again when it comes to a witness within the workplace, or a witness in the school situation or in the university situation, perhaps one of the worst things that can be done is to deal with unbelievers in a strident and angry manner. You know, always being the guy in the class who's opposing everything the teacher says, who's making it. Now, I'm not talking about withholding your testimony, because as we trust the Lord will open up opportunities for believers in work situations or school situations, and he'll open up opportunities for testimony and for witness to the Lord. And it seems to be much more effective when it is done in a quiet and respectful way, and where the person is not causing upset within the work situation or the school situation. And so again, in helping people to represent the Lord well in situations such as that, this is another principle that may be a good one to follow, and following what Daniel and his friends did here in coming respectfully to Ashpenaz and making a respectful request of him. And then in verse 11, we see a second phase. I think what has happened is that Daniel and the others have now had time to think about things, because now they're responsible to a different person. Ashpenaz, the prince of the eunuchs, he's over everything, but he has people beneath him in the organizational structure. And so in verse 11, it says, Daniel said to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And so it's as though Ashpenaz has delegated these four men to the care and to the supervision of Melzar. Now, there's question whether Melzar is a proper name or whether it's simply a word that means like a warden or an overseer. And certainly where the word comes from, it can mean those things. So whether it is the name of the person that is over them now, or whether it's simply just his position, he's their overseer. He is a step below Ashpenaz. And so Daniel and his friends have thought about what has happened. They've been denied in the first instance, and now they've had time to think about it, and they come with a solution. And so they come to Melzar, and in verse 12, they give Melzar this proposition. He says, test us, I beseech thee, for 10 days. Give us just fruit of the ground. That's what the word pulse here means. The idea of vegetables can be wider than just green vegetables, but it's kind of like a non-meat diet. And so they come to him, they say, let us have a diet of pulse to eat for 10 days. And then, and also just give us water to drink. Forget about the wine, give us water. And after the 10 days, have a look at us. And if you think that we're fading away, if our health has suffered, etc., because we're not getting the king's food, then you can make a decision after that. And so they actually come with a solution. And sometimes in a work or a school situation, there are those things that might come up where it's helpful to think about the situation and present a solution to those around us who do not know Christ. I'll give an illustration just a second. But the idea here again is respectful approach to those who have authority over us who do not know Christ. And so, for instance, maybe in a school situation, in a classroom, an assignment is given where the assignment is to do something that actually commends the LGBT, etc., all those letters, and it is in support of all of that. And perhaps as believers in that class who do not support that, you can come up with a suggestion to bring to the teacher to say, out of all good conscience and because of our beliefs, we cannot really do this assignment. However, can we suggest that you allow us to do this, and that would count? Now, you don't know if you're going to get shut down again, but at least you've taken the responsibility to stand for that which is right. And in the situation, you come with a solution. You just don't shut down. You don't get into the place where you are being obstructive in the wider group of whatever's going on, but you come with a reasonable suggestion for how the requirements can be fulfilled, but you're not dealing with that thing that you disagree with because of the scriptural teaching. And so sometimes I think you find that there are those, say in a school situation, who are expected to teach a particular curriculum, and they may not fully agree with it themselves. And so they may be open to allowing a variation in requirements for someone who comes respectfully and indicates that they're not going to do what is asked simply because of their beliefs. Now, it doesn't always happen, but the key here is that it is done in faith. This is a matter of faith. When Daniel and the others came, even though they came up with this suggestion, and even though they came in the first place to Ashpenaz and asked for to be relieved from taking the king's food and the king's diet, they came in faith, asking. When they come to Melzar, they come in faith. They don't know what's going to happen. They don't know if they're going to get shut down. They don't know if anything's something not very agreeable is going to happen to them because they refuse to take the king's food. And so they come in faith. And as we see in this particular situation, God honors their faith and God works. And because of God at work and because they have openly exercised faith in their God and moved forward, then God brings them through the situation. And so, again, perhaps some of these principles are principles that we need to be thinking through with people in difficult situations, work situations, other situations, school situations, university situations, in dealing with these issues and still maintaining a testimony for the Lord. Obviously, it doesn't always work out, but there is still the obligation to stand for the Lord and to leave the consequences to Him. In those situations, it is not wrong to do what these men did. That is, to devise an alternative and to suggest it, and leave it to the Lord again with regard to the consequences. And in this particular case, the Lord honored that and worked it out. So we're going to stop there tonight. There are other lessons to be learned here in this portion before we move on from it. But I think that this is an absolutely critical chapter when it comes to believers operating in a pagan situation. And more in our world, we as believers are operating in a pagan situation. The ethos of our society years and years ago was, in the very broadest sense, Christian. That is no longer true. And so again, for believers to operate in this situation, we need to think through some of these principles that we see here. And can I suggest that it is not just the matter of individuals thinking these things through, but assemblies thinking these things through. And when more and more pressure comes on assemblies, as it is coming, how are we going to react in this pagan situation? How are we going to stand for the Lord as a corporate group of the Lord's people? And so we'll stop there for tonight. And if you've any thoughts or comments, we'll have them after I pray. And I'm just going to stop the recording and then I'll pray.